Have the upcoming decades of work ever felt like a dirty, cold flood? Did these phantom waters seep into the basement of your soul? Are they transforming your fondest dreams into bloated absurdities far beyond repair? Have the infinite stars of your mind become cloaked in the opaque grime of commercial labor? Well, don't say you weren't warned. Participating in a market economy would have been a contemptible thing in the ancient world, an activity reserved for an unfortunate section of the population who were sub-citizens. Selling one's labor was, by Aristotle's account, something that degrades the mind. 2,000 years later, Adam Smith echoed this idea when he reflected on the division of labor, describing it as a process that makes people as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Adam Smith wasn't just hurling insults casually, but rather pointing out the logical consequence of making people ensouled tools, to borrow Aristotle's phrase. If someone specializes to perform a certain task over and over again for most of their waking hours, it's gonna stunt certain dimensions of their development. And it certainly feels like that for me. I'm lucky to have a white-collar job, but during the week my mind feels like it's trapped in a dirty, dark haze, only receiving gusts of fresh wind and sunlight on the weekend, where my mind can grow just a little bit. I know what you're thinking. Yeah, you and everybody else, princess. Wow, rude? But there's some wisdom to this bitter pill, given that this is the global status quo. Except for a small minority of people, most of us will, undoubtedly, spend most of our lives renting ourselves out to survive. And at least I wound up with a nice version of self-rental. I can work flexible hours from home. And after all, it's honorable to work, isn't it? This was one of the central questions in a Jesse Waters interview on Fox News, where he talked to Doreen Ford, a representative of the anti-work community on Reddit. Doreen was put in the unfortunate position of having to defend laziness in contrast to work, which made a bad image become even worse. So Doreen, a part-time dog walker who loves philosophy, had an unkempt appearance, skittish body language, ugly lighting, a humorless attitude, and messy room, all of which stood in stark contrast to Jesse's beautiful suit, clean studio lighting, professionally groomed hair, subtle makeup, and boisterous confidence, and not to mention rhetorical skill. Stated somewhat hyperbolically, in that interview, Doreen's interest in philosophy, compared to Jesse's practical success in the world, represents some kind of illness, a deterioration of life by becoming disconnected from beauty and strength. This was already sketched out by Aristophanes in his play Nephelai, which is Greek for the clouds, from around 420 BC. In this story, there's a guy named Strepsiades and his son Phidippides, who's been sucking the family wallet dry because of his gambling addiction. So Strepsiades is drowning in debt as a result, so he tries to get his son in a place called the Thinkery, where students are taught by some botched creature that having an easy life, shirking discipline, responsibility, and practical success, shirking all that stuff is good. It's good to be lazy. And with this in mind, they're also taught to twist words to their advantage, their philosophizing, so they can defeat creditors in court. basically kind of bums who just want to coast through life. Not a very pretty picture. And Aristophanes was poking fun at Socrates, probably the most important figure in the history of philosophy. And yet, for Aristotle, who wrote his work almost a century after Aristophanes, it was obvious that the only way to real happiness is a life of leisure. Right? Maybe you engage in the delight of philosophy and politics, but at the very least, you can't be happy if you're living under someone else's thumb. A happy worker was a contradiction in terms for Aristotle. 2,000 years later, Nietzsche kind of agreed, more on that later, and declared that anyone whose day isn't mostly free time is enslaved. Nietzsche also claimed that nobody worth their salt would look at Hera in Argos and dream of being a Polykleitos. In other words, great people who see great art don't care to waste their time with the hardship of production. They love to enjoy fruits in the shade, not hard labor in the burning sun. In fact, he goes on to claim that any worthwhile culture depends on the enslavement of laborers, and that it's a cruel joke to have the idea of dignity glued on to this kind of coerced labor. The dirty work required for survival was to be passed on to the masses who were unable to claw their way to the top of the leisure class of society by dint of their various degrees of unfreedom. Such a culture could be compared to, quoting Nietzsche here, compared to a blood-stained victor who, in his triumphal procession, carries the defeated along as slaves chained to his chariot. Slaves whom a beneficent power has so blinded that, almost crushed by the wheels of the chariot, they nevertheless still exclaim, "Dignity of labor, dignity of man." And yet, it feels obscene to have a life of leisure while everyone else toils. I'm uncomfortable being served at a restaurant since a precious human mind is being disrupted by mechanical activity rather than blooming in the direction of an obscured sun. I feel uneasy when I see cleaners mopping the same floor day after day after day. The light of their souls is slowly dimming. Nietzsche might say that this is an example of thinking that bubbled out of the slaves of society rather than its masters, what he called a slave morality. So, for example, it is disgraceful to be fortunate. There's too much misery, that kind of thing. But what if such people kind of love their jobs? What if they escaped from a country where earning money safely and having enough food to eat is a rare gift? Gratitude is an essential part of mental health, and I think it should be cultivated to the utmost degree. However, I can think of times where my lack of gratitude was motivation for developing myself in healthier directions, in increasing my strength and competence. Nietzsche offers some compelling reasons to be mistrustful of moral sentiments which we take for granted, such as patience and humility, by looking at their historical development. Let's consider a more cynical perspective. What if these workers, dubbed wage slaves by detractors, maxed out their talents by doing menial work? What if some people don't have the brains or ambition to do anything greater than floor mopping? So this sounds like Aristotle's concept of a natural slave, which describes a type of person that's best suited to become an instrument of a master who commands logos, meaning reason or creative order. A slave can apprehend logos enough to follow orders, but they do not possess it as a creative force. Now, it might be that Aristotle speculated about the possibility of natural slaves in order to cover up the ugly fact that things could be a lot more fair than they are, and that slaves lost their freedom through force and violence rather than intellectual ineptitude in a ranked cosmic order. But his basic insight is common sense. Some people are born leaders and others are a little bit more inclined to be agreeable and follow along. Take, for example, Kevin O'Leary, a Canadian businessman, and his gum story, which inspired him to become an entrepreneur. So it goes something like this. He gets hired to work at an ice cream store. His boss asks him to scrape some gum off the floor. He finds it degrading. He refuses. He gets fired, prompting his mom, Georgette, to give him some very straightforward advice. She tells him, there's two types of people in this world. Those that own the store and those that scrape the ish off the floor. You have to decide which one you are. In other words, are you a slave or are you a master? O'Leary took the advice to heart and opted for the master position. However, as the journalist Bruce Livesey has pointed out, O'Leary started a business and lied a little bit about its earnings so that it could swallow up bigger companies. Company got bigger, cooked the books a little bit more, then sold it off for a big chunk of cash while everybody else took a huge loss. The company that bought O'Leary's lemon expected $50 million in profit, only to lose $100 million, wiping out $2 billion in stock value in a single day. O'Leary, however, cashed out with about $1 million in his pocket. I think Mama would be proud. Hopefully, we can foster better masters than Kevin, but consider the question of life's purpose. How clearly driven and confident some people are, and yet for others, it's an urgent necessity to be an instrument of something or someone else. If only there were commands from a masterful source, a certainty that a brilliant logos awaits, prepackaged and palatable like a sweet breakfast cereal, as Dostoevsky puts it via his character of the Grand Inquisitor, quote, "There is no more ceaseless or tormenting care for a man, as long as he remains free, than to find someone to bow down to as soon as possible." Not a foreign feeling for me. In contrast to Plato's suggestion to punish slaves, Aristotle opts for admonition, believing that slaves are capable of some kind of understanding of logos, however imperfect. For example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he sketches out a picture of a slave who is too blinded by his anger to pay proper attention to orders. This slave receives logos in an imperfect way, storming off before it's appropriate to leave, doing a poor job as a result. However, this imperfect attention to duty may have been a calculated means of asserting some form of resistance, finding some kind of power. Black American slaves in the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass, have confirmed this, explaining that among slaves it was advantageous to dupe the master into assuming his slaves were ignorant, gave them a secret form of power. This kind of malicious compliance is a tried and true tradition in America, as explained by Homer Simpson. So in episode 21 of season 6, he says, "Lisa, if you don't like your job, you don't strike. You just go in every day and do it really half-assed. That's the American way." Homer's observation rings true, and I think this subtle vengeance is usually masked with a form of justice, or at least it hides in the safety of the crowd by saying, well, everybody does it. What's worse, though, is the common lurking desire among ostensibly kind and well-behaved people to dominate others. Douglass made the grim observation that everybody in the South wants the privilege of whipping somebody else. That is to say, even within groups of people who were dehumanized tools, there was a fight to establish some kind of pecking order so that there was at least a chance of being at the top, even if it's the top of rock bottom. Despite Aristotle's focus on slaves as members of the oikos, or household, it should be understood that slaves were involved in a wide variety of activities, like agriculture and manufacturing, which means slavery was on a spectrum. It wasn't necessarily a slow death sentence or a nightmare from beginning to end. Slaves who worked in mines lived horrible lives of near total unfreedom, but public slaves, like clerks, would be much closer to living an independent life. They'd pay rent to their distant masters and work a clean and relatively comfortable job. This spectrum of slavery was somewhat echoed in the plantation system that Douglass was familiar with in the States. Even within the same household or enterprise, there was a hierarchy of slaves, which was encouraged by masters through offering special positions and separating the house slaves from those toiling in the field, and establishing hierarchies in both domains. And if you look at Nicias, a politician in ancient Athens, he owned about 1,000 mine slaves who he forced to work in 3-foot tunnels for 10 hours a day, but he contracted out the ownership of these slaves to a non-Athenian slave, an overseer, whose slavery was much more comfortable, as you can imagine. Aristotle encouraged masters to delegate slave management to overseers, since it was a waste of time for a free man. Removing slaves and slavery from daily life, at least your perception of it, meant there was a smaller chance of cultivating pity and sympathy for people that had a pretty rough life. Nonetheless, one of Aristotle's followers, Theophrastus, he remarked that it's both righteous and useful to offer slaves the possibility of freedom. He thought masters ought to treat slaves in a managerial position with respect, offering them rewards, holidays, and even families, although the kids would basically be replacement slaves. Theophrastus also warned about the agroikos, something like a country bumpkin, a person who foolishly gets too close to his slaves. An agroikos might answer the front door by himself, might try to bang his sexy bread-baking slave, might offer to help grind up grain. He might engage slaves in conversation. Oh my God. Such behavior is a clear example of an unnatural master for Theophrastus. The only alternative to slavery, in Aristotle's eyes, was magic. If fabrics could weave themselves, for example, what would be the point of having masters and slaves? But since no such magic existed, anybody who was free and had money would obviously just get someone else to slave away for them to do the work. It would have been bizarre for a free person to make stuff on the market to get income, since this was a waste of time for a citizen. As Xenophon put it quite bluntly, he said, "Those who can afford it have slaves as co-workers." He even came up with an idea of something like the universal basic income, where the state would provide for every citizen using the revenues from publicly owned slaves working in the mines. Aristotle saw that the actual enslavement of other people resulted from an abundance of violent force, which he termed unnatural slavery. But how could it be that there was so much unnatural slavery? Why was nature so confused? And more specifically, how could it be justified that Greece did such a thing? The answer was that anybody who wasn't Greek was really a barbarian, something a little bit less than human. So you couldn't really expect them to be more than slaves. There was a general understanding that the barbarian's inferiority was reflected in its physical constitution, either in stark or subtle forms. For example, Socrates claimed that free men in the gym had a different scent than slaves, presumably less stinky, whereas Theognis said that a slave's head is never upright, but always bent, and he has a slanting neck. This makes me think of the Virgin and Chad memes, where there's this frail wisp of a man with a slanted neck, and he's always the butt of the joke. Aesop, who wrote the famous Aesop's Fables, he was originally a slave, and he became a famous Greek author. But since he was from a conquered barbarian population, from Thrace, he's described in some unfavorable terms. For example, pot-bellied, weasel-armed, hunchbacked, a squalid, squinting, swarthy midget with crooked legs. Using people's physiology to justify their position in this social hierarchy has a long history and still plays an important role in 21st century life. Sometimes in unexpected ways. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Abe and Homer start a business together, and Abe tries to think of something nice to say about Homer. In the past, he's called him an accident and a stupid screw-up. And the best thing that Abe can come up with is, "I was always proud that you were not a short man." And empirical studies which examine the link between intelligence and height found that bishops tend to be smaller than preachers in small towns, sales managers are taller than salesmen, white-collar workers are taller than blue-collar workers. In one study, they found that a 1-inch increase in height might boost your weekly earnings up to 3%. The overall correlation coefficient between intelligence and height is 0.2, which means it's a very small effect, but it's not nothing. And it does play out in real life. In internet memes, the intellectually inferior person in the joke is immediately clear if they're rendered as ugly and deformed. The so-called retard Wojak template features caricatures where people's eyes are asymmetrical, they have drool and snot pouring out of their orifices, they have bad teeth, misshapen heads, they're inappropriately emotional. So their bodies preclude a grasp of logos or its command. They're a sort of natural slave. This isn't too far from reality. There's a couple of guys who work at my local grocery store. They move carts around and stuff like that. And they struggle to perform these tasks with any kind of grace, these simple tasks. And they look like they have some kind of congenital malformation, deformity. Civility demands that such people be treated with the utmost kindness and respect. I once had a dream where I looked into a mirror and my face was unusually beautiful. All the things I hated about it were fixed and the results were spectacular. It's so much nicer being really beautiful. But as I kept staring at the mirror, a series of cancerous growths started to spread in my left eye, pushing the eye out and morphing the left side of my skull into this hideous blob. And I started to panic. I thought, how could this happen to me? How could I stand to be such a hideous monster for the rest of my life? Don't I deserve love and respect like all human beings do? Right? Despite my unfortunate fate in life? It's a nice idea and represented beautifully in paintings like Ritratto di Vecchio col Nipote, an old man and his grandson, painted by Domenico Ghirlandaio from around 1490. One thing I love about this painting is that the subjects are anonymous. It's unknown who they are or whether or not they're related. And I think that's part of Ghirlandaio's point. The healthy young boy is the glowing hope, not just of his family, but his nation, his planet. And this boy honors and loves his ugly and perfect predecessors, honors their traditions, making them stronger and sharper. Ghirlandaio was, after all, one of Michelangelo's teachers. Yes, the Michelangelo. This painting reminds me of my grandfather, whose health was pretty shaky. He had these very unusual nervous tics that I thought were normal, only to later grow up and realize that he was kind of like a freak in that respect. But he always showed me the most gentle, loving side of a person that is, I think, humanly possible. He showed this to me no matter what I did, apparently. And once when my parents were driving us home from the airport, I was sitting with him in the back seat, and I was so happy to see him, just this one person in the world who just like exuded love. He didn't exude it for everybody, but for his grandkids, he sure did. So I was so happy to see him that I hugged him and held on to him for as long as I could, until my back started to spasm with pain. But these loving attitudes are very rare. My grandfather, as I said, did not exude much love towards people outside his family. And I think that's to be expected. You can't really encompass all the rejects of society. It's hard enough to really love your family. And all of my personal experiences taught me that there are many people who are above me. They're treated and recognized as such by others, both for good reasons and bad. When I worked at a factory, I spoke with one of the machine operators who pulled 12-hour shifts, doing loud and challenging labor. He was middle-aged and had resigned himself to performing mindless duties for money for his family, explaining that his performance in school had effectively doomed him to the lower caste of society. That's life, he said. And I'm like, wait, what? I thought that everybody has the same dignity, no matter their family background, their intelligence, and their schooling. Well, someone has to do the dirty work. And just because, two people banged and created a person, that might not translate into everybody on the planet scrambling to give that child the finest things in life. When I was a kid, I found it hard to understand why my parents bugged me so incessantly about school. It's like, you got to do well in school. You got to do well in school. I kept thinking, I'm valuable, aren't I? I thought all kids are valuable. The world will recognize our value and things are going to be fine. Right? Well, my parents knew through difficult and painful experience as immigrants, through a scar left on their psyches, that the world will eat me alive if I don't jump through the requisite hoops, burning hoops though they may be. And I'll be lucky if I have a somewhat decent job being a so-called wage slave. This acceptance, however, comes at a cost, which is that the mind becomes dumb. It becomes corrupted by slavish thought, like an excessive tendency towards self-abasement and obedience. Nietzsche identified this as the Christian tendency. In other words, you're in a position of weakness and vulnerability and pain. You're at the bottom, and then you flip the world upside down, so you come out on top. Right? Spirit instead of matter. This is something like the flip described in The Thinkery by Aristophanes, where athleticism and responsible worldly success is ignored in favor of so-called spiritual things. In small doses, this flip can be pretty great. How else are you going to appreciate the richness of the mind, its creativity, its various sublimations? Foucault became a scholar by reading a lot to impress a cute guy he had a crush on. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche describes the order of rank as a formula for what he calls the supreme law of life itself. That is to say, the stronger life, the strongest life, seeks to ascend, which necessarily places it above the weaker forms of life. This is a simple common sense observation. Some people are healthier, stronger, braver, smarter, more beautiful than others, and they reap the rewards for it. This is anti-Christian in the sense that it is worldly. Differences in details in this life matter, and these differences will necessarily lead to uneven outcomes in the hierarchy. At the top of the social pyramid, there's delicious fruits called privileges. But, Nietzsche argues, there's a certain privilege in being mediocre. Life's more difficult the higher up you go. There's tremendous responsibility, competition and pressure, employment, so crafts, trade, farming, science, most of art. All of that depends on people with mediocre abilities and desires. To quote Nietzsche here, he says, "To be a public utility, a wheel, a function, you need to be destined for this by nature. It is not society, but rather the type of happiness that the vast majority of people cannot rise above, that make them intelligent machines. For the mediocre, mediocrity is a happiness. Mastery of one thing, specialization as a natural instinct. It would be completely unworthy of a more profound spirit to have any objection to mediocrity as such. Mediocrity is needed before there can be exceptions. It is the condition for a high culture. When an exceptional person treats a mediocre one more delicately than he treats himself and his equals, this is not just a courtesy of the heart, it is his duty." And he sort of agrees, but also diverges with Aristotle. Natural slaves are destined for mediocrity, he says, but this is their happiness. The golden pyramid has more gold the farther down you go. There's some empirical data that supports Nietzsche's view. Scholars like Ed and Carol Diener published a study in the late 1990s called "Most People Are Happy," where they looked at nationally representative surveys and found that out of 43 nations, 86% of them had what was termed a positive level of subjective well-being, or SWB. My skepticism is inflamed when I read stuff like this because a survey is pretty low as a scientific standard, and serious-sounding designations like SWB kind of mask the lack of hard science. And yet, it also matches my experience. When I go to the city and I see people enjoying themselves, my overwhelming impression is that wage slaves can in fact be very happy indeed. Most of them, at least. They got brunch on the patio, colorful nightclubs, cappuccinos, lattes, cosmopolitanos. They got fun festivals, exciting concerts, blockbuster movies, steak and lobster dinners, world-class sports teams, quick hookups, bread and circus abounds. In other words, it's the sulking minority who struggle to understand the happy majority. Here's an excerpt of a post I found on the incels.is forum. And quote, "At every job I've worked, they've always kept me at the bottom of the barrel and talked down to me as if I'm an idiot because I do not share their delusional, sad state of positive vibes, bro." That's the quote. It's a little bit of extra salt in that dish. The number mentioned earlier, 86%, is a rough approximation of a complex subjective phenomenon, but it's an interesting figure because it's almost the inverted image of antidepressant use. So about 18% of women and 8% of guys pop happy pills in the United States. Now, I think that those drugs are dangerous and wildly overprescribed, but that makes an even better case for the observations by Team Diener, which is that most people like being alive most of the time. And drugs like Sugar, weed, coffee, booze, and opiates all help fill the gap. Psychedelics can even help people heal their minds and find extravagant joy in the most mundane things. There's no shortage of fun and cheap consolations, but also profound luxuries, sometimes hidden. Foster points out that in the Renaissance, the poet Beccadelli sold one of his country estates to buy a copy of Livy's History of Rome, a book which is now freely and easily accessible online. Although I'm sure many people wouldn't even take it for free. And yet, amidst all these consolations, there are some people that want to stir up some trouble. I want to quote Nietzsche here. Who do I hate most among the rabble today? The socialist rabble, the Chandala apostles who undermine workers' instincts and pleasures, their feelings of modesty about their little existences, who make them jealous, who teach them revenge. Injustice is never a matter of unequal rights. It is a matter of claiming equal rights. What is bad? But I've already said it. Everything that comes from weakness, from jealousy, from revenge. The anarchist and the Christian are descended from the same lineage. Here, I want to point out that Doreen Ford identifies as an anarchist. Again, Nietzsche's observation echoes my experience. I've noticed a thirst for power and revenge masking itself with noble robes. Remember what Frederick Douglass said. There's a great temptation among everybody to grab the whip and make subordinates. Tax the rich, eat the rich. These have become common phrases, further spreading resentment and hollowing out trust between employers and employees. This makes me think of a song from the 60s by Malvina Reynolds called Little Boxes. It's sung in this annoying voice as a way to make fun of her target, which is boring suburbs. It's something like, little boxes made of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same. I mean, I hate suburban conformity too, with a passion, but I'm imagining an anthropologist going to a remote village with huts and making fun of them for being homogenous and boring. Sounds to me kind of like a cranky old woman just attacking strangers. I'm imagining Grandpa Simpson, shaking his fist at the clouds. My translation of her sarcastic message is something like, I live in the suburbs, I am stupid, I am dumb and boring and stupid. It's like, she wrote it while going to the Friends Committee on Legislation, a nonprofit that promotes peace and justice. It might just be my crazy mind, might just be my crazy ears. I'm not getting a lot of inclusive love vibes from that song. More like vengeful contempt for society? I don't know. Compare it with Vashti Bunyan and her record, Just Another Diamond Day, this gentle song resting in a deep love and admiration for existence, which sees a grain of wheat like a glowing gem, that sings of giving love and food to children, something that she actually spent most of her life doing. Oh, well, maybe Reynolds inspired people to reach for something greater than mediocre life in the suburbs, to help their creativity flourish. And that's great. But who would you rather have on the peace committee? But just because someone is wealthy and upper class doesn't mean they automatically have a profound spirit. They might be focused on making a lot of money, showing off, buying up property out of boredom, rather than contributing to the flourishing of higher culture. How many people at the top treat the mediocre more delicately than they treat themselves and their equals, like Nietzsche said? What great spirits can we find? What comes to my mind is King Philip II and El Escorial, a palace from the 16th century, which is about an hour's drive northwest of Madrid. It's a strange name for a palace. Escoria means slag heap, scum. In Cuba, escoria is used to describe losers, outcasts. Escorial is a dump. As you can see, this is quite the opposite. I'm guessing it's a fun little dig at himself, a little bit of humility, something like that. Although, unlike some people who sing about how much they hate boring people and buildings, Philip endeavored to actually create fantastic beauty that transcends time. I think he succeeded. After all, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, and over 500,000 people visit it every year. So I'd call it a home run. For our purposes, it's worth mentioning because King Philip II was hundreds of years ahead of the curve, not just because he instated an early form of the assembly line, but because he treated his workers very well. In distinction to everybody else at the time, and for many years after, Philip issued a royal edict that specified the workday, 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the afternoon, organized in a way that's convenient for the workers and lets them take care of their personal health. They had 10 days of vacation, a full salary, half pay during any recovery from illness or injury. Could be better, but it's pretty good, and it didn't require thousands of people rioting in the streets like it was in America. He just had the kind of spirit that understood it's his duty to treat people well, because society functions properly that way, and you can build magnificent, beautiful things. It took 35 years to build El Escorial, and what 35-year marvel of beauty are we dedicated to now? What is beauty to a fragmented culture like ours? How can we cultivate the kind of spirit that has strength, valor, and vision while possessing a magnanimous attitude towards its inferiors? We can certainly see failed attempts and small spirits in recent history. Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator who was in power when I was born, ordered the construction of the world's largest administrative building, Casa Poporului, the House of the People, slightly larger in volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This monstrosity was built with forced labor, with soldiers, and a lot of volunteers to cut costs. All the while, citizens were starving and babies were dying in the hospital because they don't have electricity in the winter. While Philip believed in something more than himself, Ceausescu was mostly concerned with the glory of Ceausescu, a petty spirit, a shallow spirit, not a profound spirit. No doubt Ceausescu was influenced by his painful and harsh life. He ran away from home as a young kid because he was getting beaten by his father. He spent a lot of time locked up in prison for his political agitation, ironically, in the name of workers' rights. I think one of the frustrations of being employed is that an employee is almost by definition discouraged from being creative. Delegating tasks means that orders have to be followed, so personal autonomy is sacrificed. This sacrifice seems to be a necessary feature of the fact that people are not equal and some are suited to being above others. But this is a painful sacrifice that can drive many to suicidal despair. If you want to see that, just go to the incels forum that I mentioned. It's not easy to sacrifice your autonomy. It is not easy to sacrifice your creativity, to sacrifice the most vital part of your soul just because you've been bested by someone more powerful. We need more great spirits that reach out with delicacy to the average worker. In the Greek state, Nietzsche expresses what he thought was the brazen ancient Greek instinct, quote, "To the victor belongs the vanquished, with wife and child, life and property. Power gives the first right, and there is no right which at bottom is not presumption, usurpation, violence." However, remember the words of Queen Clytemnestra uttered after murdering King Agamemnon in an act of vengeance. "As he sinned by the sword, so is death by the sword his atonement." That is to say, if you want to play power politics, watch your back. You're entering a dangerous space filled with predators where buoyant ideals are drowned in blood. Jordan Peterson makes the case that power isn't necessarily just a blind, brutal thing. It can be oriented towards the power of competence, benevolence, and creativity. It can design el escorial and be generous towards workers. Part of a project of building a high culture might involve a loving eye towards mediocrity, to recognize the sacrifices that people make on a regular basis to keep the social organism intact, one that blooms rare and precious flowers. Not to stir up destructive storms of vengeance, but soft rains that foster growth and abundance. Easier said than done. I think that's why people like Peterson make such a big deal of Christianity. King Philip II was a devout Catholic, and his pro-social behavior might have been related to his faith. In any case, modern Christianity is more akin to the Roman Empire's values than the original repudiation of them. It stands for respecting authority, tradition, ritual, family, convention, responsibility. Not a bad idea if you want a stable and reliable place to live. I don't hear a lot of people citing St. Paul and explaining that total celibacy and retreat into a monastery is their ideal. My impression of people that describe themselves as Christian is they come from a moderately successful conservative family. They care about education, raising kids, hard work, practical success, polite manners. Boring, yes, but they're not going to be throwing Molotov cocktails at my grandma's building. People like David Mitchell joke about how it's a good thing that people working crappy jobs are nasty to everybody because they should be upset at having their brains rot. Resentment is understandable and relatable. I'm filled with it myself. I wouldn't have obsessively thought about this topic otherwise. But the question is, what is the direction of this resentment? What will it build after it tears down its targets? The common parental wisdom here is that being a resentful loser is poison for everybody. So clean your room, organize your resources, plan for your ambitions, strengthen the relationships with your family and friends, prove your worth to the world, and maybe, just maybe, your life will get better. But, keep in mind that suffering is guaranteed, so you need to find your meaning or else you'll collapse. And meaning comes from being part of a group. Durkheim pointed out that a way to reduce egoistic suicide, the kind of suicide that comes about from being alienated from society, the best way to reduce that is to just join a group. In any group, it doesn't matter what it's about. And Christianity is strongly influenced by the idea of accepting the outcasts. It encourages pro-social behavior. All of these things are necessary for a healthy culture to flourish. At the very least, it's fun to sing with strangers and connect with the community on a regular basis that way. And religion might be a soothing substance for the masses, a narcotic, you might even say. But why should we masses avoid having our pain soothed? Why not enjoy the necessary relief of a good TV show, of an afternoon lunch with a friend, a dance party with a family, a stoned cuddle session with a lover? There's no doubt that hedonism can be taken to a destructive extreme, dramatized in Nietzsche's concept of the last man, but it might play an important role in redirecting resentment to something more beneficial. I see people posting Peterson's own messy room, effectively saying, "You're not perfect, you slipped up." But Peterson has had thousands of people earnestly declare that his advice has dramatically improved their lives. I find he often gives pretty good pep talks that snap me out of a resentful state of mind, helps me focus on healthier goals. What are his detractors doing to improve the lot of directionless, angry young people? People who are just waiting for an excuse to take revenge against God, society, capitalism, the universe, something. Will they write songs about how he's a stupid alt-right neo-Nazi grifter and his audience is a bunch of pathetic incels? Well, good luck with that. Once I got a call from an old lady who was in tears giving me effusive compliments because of a drawing of Madonna and Christ that I sold to her grandson, and it was a lovely feeling. Highly recommended. So, Going back to the painting by Domenico di Tommaso Curati di Boffo Bigordi, also known as Domenico Ghirlandaio, I'll put this broad but important question to you in Italian, just to throw you a little curveball. Come farai a essere il nipote del tuo vecchio? Che tipo di vecchio sarai per tuo nipote? And King Philip II might add, ¿Cuál es tu Escorial?